Hey YouTubers, Bad Dog here. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about racism and how we as a people are being played big time. Please watch the video to the end. There is a very, very important video at the end that will enlighten you and blow your mind at the same time. I'm going to be bringing you some facts and some opinion as to why I believe the slaves were set free in 1865 and how the wealthy elite are behind this. They are all about smoke and mirrors and deception. They want us to fight amongst each other. They do not ever want us to come together. None of this information is to ever downplay the fact that African Americans were brought here as slaves to do hard labor for people that could afford the slaves. In my view, slavery never should have happened. Every human being that is born has the right, God-given right, to be free. Now I'm going to give you the facts and opinions as I know them. In 1850, Samuel Rembert and Judith Prescott received the first patent for the cotton harvester. Edmund Quincy invented the first, as far as I know, corn picker. This was around the time of 1850. Okay? So the slaves supposedly became free, I guess on paper, with law, in 1865. Some people say different dates than others. But the point is, the only reason I believe that the slaves were let go was the inventions of the machinery, which was more profit. Okay, so I figure the time it takes to tweak these machines and mass produce them was probably, I'm guessing, 20, 30, maybe 40 years. Okay, so during this time, the slaves were slowly let go. They fought in wars. This is all about commerce. And the people that can afford the slaves, that can afford the machines, it's all about profit. Now let's look at some historical facts that almost probably every group of people, Australian, Irish, Caucasian, Black, they've all been slaves, and they've had multiple different racial slave owners.
Ancestor was out on one Sunday with his girlfriend, and some white man jumps out of the bush and throws a net over him. It's not how it happened. Slavery was big business. Africans sold other Africans to the Europeans.
But the memory of slavery and of what our ancestors must have gone through is always lurking. Even a pretty little harbor town like Elmina is dominated by its slave castle. And for us, a slave castle is like Auschwitz.
Right in here. This very dungeon housed between 150 and 200 women for 3 good months. This is where they slept, yes, but the place was much overcrowded, so there wasn't enough space for one even to lie down. The result was an outbreak of malaria and yellow fever. So by the time the ships arrived, more than half were already dead. Well, this is the infamous room of no return. That is also the door of no return. When the slaves got here, they never knew where they were going. Neither did they know what was going to happen to them. All they knew was to get out of this room onto the boats. Some actually committed suicide. because that was the only way they thought they could get their freedom. In fact, it was the Africans who did the raiding and selling of Africans to the Europeans. No European ever went into the hinterland to raid for slaves. It was the Africans who did it. And before the Europeans even landed here, slavery was already in the system. It was slaves that worked in the palaces for the kings.
I thought it was more, even at that time, than just money. It had to be just something else that drove them to just kill these people.
Yeah, why brutalize them like that?
Why brutalize? But then again, I guess that's justification on rationalization. If you brutalize it, then you have to say to yourself, there's no way we as a Christian people could brutalize other humans, so they can't be humans.
But did it surprise you when you found out that Africans were involved as well as middlemen?
I knew that Africans were involved. I didn't know the extent to what they were involved. And I also didn't know that once they found out what was going on here, and I know that they had to know what was going on here, that they stayed a willing participant in it. That's the crazy part of it.
I think I was surprised and hurt and angry and everything because, these were people that, I sort of had a fantasy about them and as our ancestors, and your ancestors don't sell you. So that fantasy was sort of blown away. And
the dirtiest secret in African American history is that a surprisingly high percentage of the free Negroes in the South owned slaves themselves. And some of them owned, we explain it away by saying, oh, but they only own their mother, or they only own, they own their mother, they own their sister, they own their wife, and they own some other workers too. A surprisingly high number owned workers who they did not liberate.
How about the free blacks in America in 1860 during slavery? The leading African-American historian, John Hope Franklin of Duke, records that in New Orleans, which had the largest concentration of free blacks in the South, over 3,000 or 28% of free Negroes owned slaves. So free blacks in New Orleans were 5 times more likely to have black slaves than the average white Southerner. You see, there's no unique evil in white people. So you take into account African history, and African American is far more likely to have a direct ancestor who enslaved black people than is a white person. Should black people today be punished for their history of slavery? That sounds crazy, doesn't it? But it's exactly what the discrimination against whites and reparations are justified by.
Now, that's not to say that Caucasian people did not enslave their own black people that they came across. I'm sure that was going on as well. The point is that slavery was big business.
The following is a News 7 Black History Special, Black Slaves, Red Masters. Hello everyone, I'm Sam Ford. Earlier this month in our 7 Inside Reports, I took a personal journey to look at a largely unknown chapter of black history when my ancestors and thousands of other blacks were slaves, not of the whites, but of the Indians. Well, a lot of people responded who'd missed some of the segments and who wanted to know more about the subject. So today you'll see it all and more, and get your pencils. At the end we'll have not a test, but an address and phone number where you can get more information. Every summer at Tahlequah, Oklahoma, the Cherokee Indians sponsor their Trail of Tears pageant, the story of how the U.S. government robbed the so-called 5 civilized tribes of their homelands in the South and moved them by force to Oklahoma. They don't tell about the thousands of blacks the tribes brought with them, their slaves.
My mammy and pappy belonged to a part Cherokee named W.P. Thompson when I was born.
The woman reading is my sister, Elaine Ford Staton, but the words are those of our great-grandmother, Phyllis Thompson Pettit, whose Georgia-born parents were brought by the Cherokees over the trail. Johnson Thompson was Phyllis's brother.
Before that, Pappy had been owned by 3 different masters. One was the rich Joe Van, who lived down at Weber's Fall, and another was Chief Lowry of the Cherokees.
My cousin, Maurice Shepard, reading the words of his great-grandfather. The interviews were conducted 52 years ago here at Fort Gibson, Oklahoma, when both my great-grandmother, Phyllis Pettit, and her brother, Johnson Thompson, were in their 80s, part of a federal writers project. Now, both of them are buried in this cemetery. But after I read their words, I was set on a mission to find out how my family became slaves of the Indians. I learned that beginning with the administration of George Washington, it was the policy of the U.S. government to civilize the Indians by teaching them modern farming techniques.
To adopt agricultural practices that patterned after the whites, and one of those in the South was slave trade.
I don't ever talk about it very much because I think it's a very shameful part of Cherokee history, and so I've purposely avoided involving myself in that whole issue.
While the current chief may be ashamed, at the Cherokee Museum today are slave bills of sale, including one for 3 slaves bought in 1841 by then Principal Chief John Ross. The chief and his brother Lewis were among the biggest slaveholders in the tribe. Indeed, many of my mother, Kathleen's ancestors, the Rosses, were owned by the chief's family.
They were Southerners. They adopted Southern institutions, Southern dress, Southern black slavery.
But one characteristic they did not like was Southern greed for their land. By 1830, through wars and treaties, the 5 tribes had lost most of it. Then they were all ordered to move west to Oklahoma. 4 of the tribes left, but the Cherokees took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court and won. At least they won the lawsuit. Then the man on the $20 bill stepped in.
And President Jackson essentially told the Supreme Court, you know, you made your ruling in favor of the Cherokees, now, you know, try to enforce it.
As president, Andrew Jackson controlled the Army, so 14,000 Cherokees and 1,600 slaves were herded to Oklahoma, some groups in winter, with about a quarter of the Indians and blacks dying along the way.
You got plenty of Indians right today don't like Andrew Jackson in this area.
84-year-old Luther Scales, who describes himself as 1/4 black and 3/4 Indian, is president of the Coweta, Oklahoma Historical Society. He remembers stories his Creek Indian grandfather told him about the removal, which was devastating for the Creeks as well.
He said the roughest part of it was crossing the Mississippi River in a boat.
How so?
Well, man, the Mississippi River, do you know down there in Arkansas and Mississippi, when you're talking about a mile across, mile or so across the river. And then in a boat, as swift as that water running, well, you got problems.
Once in Oklahoma, the slaves were put to work, raising cotton, building the new nations. The Merle home, which still stands outside Tahlequah, Oklahoma, was built by the Cherokees' black slaves. And should you think the Indians were much kinder masters than the whites, listen to Granny Phyllis's words in the interview about my great-grandfather.
My husband was George Pettit. He told me his mammy was sold away from him when he was a little boy. He looked down a long lane after her just as long as he could see her and cried after her. He went down to the big road and sat down by his mammy's barefoot tracks in the sand and sat there until it got dark, and then he come on back to the quarters.
Oklahomans reenacting the Civil War Battle of Honey Springs. When it actually occurred, this was the Creek Nation in Indian Territory, slave territory, in which all of the 5 civilized tribes had signed treaties supporting the South. And the battle actually looked much like something out of the movie Glory, except it wasn't the 54th Massachusetts, but the 1st Kansas Colored Regiment that saved the day. Because of fear of attacks from nearby Kansas, many Indian slave owners fled south.
I can just remember when Master John Harnish took us to Texas. We went in a covered wagon with oxen and camped out all along the way.
My sister, Elaine Ford Staton, reading the words of our great-grandmother, Phyllis Pettit, a girl at the time of the war. In ex-slave interviews conducted by federal workers during the Depression, she told how her brother, Johnson Thompson, and her parents were sold from one Cherokee master to another and taken to Texas.
and Pappy done the driving of the oxen. I would sit in a wagon and listen to him pop his whip and holler.
On the square of the old Cherokee capital in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, stands a monument to Cherokee Confederate war dead. But the war here was confusing. While Cherokee Chief John Ross was arrested by the Union Army and shipped to D.C., his mansion was burned to the ground by Cherokee Confederate General Stan Wadey, who just didn't like the chief. And while Creek Chief Samuel Chakotay fought for the South, Apathalea, another Creek chief, fought for the Unions, his slaves at his side. In any event, when the war was over, the tribes who'd all signed Confederate treaties were in trouble.
The United States government informed the 5 civilized tribes that all previous treaties are null and void. And the first thing to be accomplished is to sign a peace treaty.
The new treaties meant the Indians lost more land, and since this wasn't legally considered the United States, Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had not covered Indian slaves, so the treaty said they had to be freed.
One of the things the federal government required in those treaties was that these tribes adopt the blacks as equal members of the tribe, their former slaves.
One day, old Master stayed after he ate breakfast, and when us Negroes come in to eat, he said, "After today, I ain't your master anymore. You all as free as I am. We just stand and look and don't know what to say about it."
The words of her brother, Johnson Thompson, read by his great-grandson, Maurice Shepard.
Pappy wanted to go back to his mother when the war was over and the slaves were freed. He made a deal with Dave Mounts, a white man who was moving into the Indian country, to drive for him.
Granny Phyllis described a harrowing trip in which they had to fight off wolves with fire from their camp, a wagon journey over land and water that lasted 5 weeks.
When we would come to a river, we would cross ferry boats, but me and brother rode on a bed in the back of the wagon, and when we were crossing a river, Father would make us lie down and wouldn't let us look out. He was afraid we would fall out in the river.
Finally, they arrived back to Fort Gibson in northeastern Oklahoma, where their father's mother was working as a cook for the U.S. soldiers.
My grandma, Phyllis Harnage, was the mother of the Colored Baptist Church on 4 Mile Branch, east of Fort Gibson. She organized the church and was head of it as long as she lived.
Since the Cherokee tribe owned all the land, as new Cherokee citizens, the family merely picked a spot. After Granny Phyllis Pettit married, her first child was my grandmother, Lutetia, whose third child was my dad, Sammy. Pettits and Fords still own this land today.
All through history, there has been different ethnic groups of slaves. These slaves were taken over by either force with weapons or just strength in numbers for the sole purpose of profit. And yes, even the white man was a slave at one time.
Out there, it's your boy Ishmael Law coming at you again. Just wanted to respond back. I had got an email sent to me. A sister had asked a question if I knew anything about white slavery. And I do, and I'll be happy to share the information with you. I'll give you a brief overview kind of about white slavery, what I do know about it. I took a couple notes, and I also wanted to share with you a couple of books. I got a nice library here at the crib. 2 books that I would probably recommend for you to get for a good foundation of white slavery is They Were White and They Were Slaves. It's by Michael Hoffman. It's a decent book. As well as White Cargo. This is by 2 authors. Don Jordan and Michael Walsh. So again, White Cargo and They Were White and They Were Slaves. 2 books. There are other books that are out there, but I'll share with you what I do know about it. White slavery has been in America. There have been white slaves in America for over 100 years. I'm talking about the hidden history of white people not knowing that they were slaves. This happened for over 100 years. There's a professor at Yale, David Bryan Davis is his name. And the quote that's coming from David Bryan Davis October 11th, 1990, is that as early as the 14th to the 15th century, white slaves were shipped to multiple countries. It was labeled as like a booming slave trade during that time on the markets in the Black Sea coast, in the Italy, Spain, Egypt, and the Mediterranean islands, as well as Barbados to Virginia. I'm going to focus right now, particularly on, since we're dealing with America, the Barbados to Virginia connection. Again, that's the 14th to the 15th century of white slaves being used. Barbados during that time would literally beat their white slaves to death.
Okay, I'm going to stop there because confines of time. In 1933, under President Roosevelt, the United States of America filed bankruptcy and formed a corporation, the United States Corporation. Welcome to the plantation. So from my understanding, the United States was broke back in 1933, and the only thing they could pledge as collateral was the citizens as sweat equity, as future money that these citizens will make. Research maritime admiralty law. A lot of that information should open your eyes. You see, when you were born, there was a corporate side of you that was created through your birth certificate. This is commonly known as the straw man. Take out your driver's license, your social security card, any bank statements, and most of your mail. You're going to see that your name is in all capital letters. That represents the straw man, the corporate side of you that has been created supposedly in your benefit. Just like a graveyard, it's in all capital letters on the tombstone. There is a reason for that. They consider you basically dead. There's law of the land and law of the sea. It goes way back to the Roman days. It has something to do with lost vessels at sea, dead structures. So they basically brought the law of the sea into every land. It's not just here in the U.S., it's pretty much all over the world, most of the courts. Okay, so the maritime admiralty law, when you walk into, say you're in court, and they all say, all rise. I used to think that was out of respect. Well, it's not. They give you life, and then they take it back away when they ask you to sit down. When you walk through the gates to approach the judge, to take your place past the gates, that signifies you boarding a ship. Another example is that all ships are referred to as she. When a ship comes into its dock, it's in its berth position, and then it unloads the freight, which is basically money. Okay, so we are 90% water. When your mother's water broke, you were delivered, and the doctor signed the birth certificate, which is very much like a dock receipt. So do your own research. Maritime admiralty law, it's a fascinating subject to how things have come to be the way they are. So this is just one huge plantation. We are all slaves to the debt that will never, ever be paid off. Now I'm going to show you one of the movies you can find on this channel. They Own You, Part 1. After a little piece of George Carlin telling the truth, you will see a timeline for how this came to be that you can research.
people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their money, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of their property until their children will wake up homeless. Thomas Jefferson. Following is a timeline demonstrating when and how a private central banking cartel got control of the government, the people, and the assets of the United States. Each fact is supported by official sources. Source documents are available at www.anticorruptionsociety.com under the tab Source Documents. 1913. With the passage of the Federal Reserve Act, a private foreign banking cartel was made the fiscal agent of the United States. Source document, Representative McFadden, Congressional Record, June 1932. From the website of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, quote, "The entry of the United States into World War I added to the responsibilities of the young Federal Reserve Bank. It helped finance U.S. military expenditures by becoming the fiscal agent of the federal government." 1920. Congress handed the U.S. Treasury over to the same private banking cartel via the Independent Treasury Act. Source document, Independent Treasury Act, 1920. 1921. The Council on Foreign Relations was founded to direct the media. Paul Warburg was its first director. Warburg also drafted the Federal Reserve Act and became the Fed's first governor. Paul Warburg was an agent for the Rothschilds banking dynasty. 1925. The United States Corporation Company was chartered in perpetuity in Florida by its fiscal agent. Source document, Articles of Incorporation, United States Corporation Company. This company was created without the approval of Congress, nor the knowledge and authority of the American people. Note, in 1925, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York had offices on Cedar Street and on Broadway, both cited in the Articles of Incorporation. Source document, Articles of Incorporation, United States Corporation Company. The United States Corporation Company created a maximum of 100 shares of stock. Source document, Articles of Incorporation, United States Corporation Company. The Articles of Incorporation revealed the names of 3 individuals who held only 5 shares. The other shareholders were not identified. 1920s. The U.S. Treasury was raided by the private Federal Reserve Bank, who then caused the Great Depression and bankrupted the United States Corporation Company. Source document, Representative Lewis McFadden. Congressional Record, June 1932. 1933. A state of emergency was claimed, and Congress gave the President unconstitutional emergency powers. Source document, Congressional Record, March 1933. On behalf of the private Federal Reserve, President Roosevelt confiscated the people's gold and forced all to use the Federal Reserve notes from then on. Source document, Congressional Record, March 1933. The Federal Reserve is a private corporation. Therefore, their notes are privately owned currency. The people and the property of the United States was hypothecated and placed unlawfully in a public trust. Source document, Representative Trafficant, Congressional Record, March 1993. Hypothecate means to pledge as security without delivery of possession. 1933. The Internal Revenue Service was chartered in Delaware as a private corporation. It is not a division of the U.S. Treasury. Source document, Internal Revenue Service Corporate Charter, 1933. The United States is a private corporation with unnamed stockholders. A private corporation is its fiscal agent. A private corporation owns and circulates the currency we are forced to use. a private corporation expects us to pay them taxes. The U.S. CEO, the President, has maintained unconstitutional emergency powers for the past 80 years. Source document Senate Report 93549 and Continuation of the National Emergency 2012-2013. Quote, all United States offices, officials, and departments are now operating within a de facto status in name only under emergency war powers, with the constitutional Republican form of government now dissolved. Source document, Representative Trafficant, Congressional Record, March 1993. Today, as has been demonstrated, the United States is just a corporate franchised network represented by their all-caps names such as State of Ohio. Corporate statutes have replaced laws. A corporate statute is a rule of a corporation given the force of law by the consent of the parties. This consent generally requires a signed contract. From Judge Dale, author of The Great American Adventure, page 102, quote, the federal and state governments are not real. They are privately owned corporations called governments, and the law is nothing more than their corporate regulations called statutes, unquote. As corporations have no souls to save nor bodies to incarcerate, they are just dead legal structures. A dead legal structure cannot represent living people nor obligate living people to laws. Therefore, a corporation cannot be a sovereign government. It can only be a legal structure for commercial contracts, which is all the so-called United States government franchise network is. From Judge Dale's The Great American Adventure, page 10, quote, all of this deception is compounded by the refusal of ordinary Americans to realize, know, or understand that it is this secrecy and duplicity of privately owned corporations being surreptitiously portrayed as American agencies and government that they have come together to fleece the American people. For more information, read Judge Dale's The Great American Adventure. Free online at Anti-Corruption Society.
Norville, Benning, the man.
Okay, this next subject I want to talk about real quick is how the media takes situations like this, where this woman is clearly has some mental issues. On top of that, she's a bitch. I'm sorry, but she's white trash. She is setting a bad example for her children. She is threatening this black man that had nothing to do with anything. He just started his truck. But this is the kind of thing that the media will grab onto to inspire division, to inspire hate. I know that racism exists on both sides of the fence. But I feel like racism is really being pushed in the media, with the police. There are white people that are killed by the police, there are Mexicans that are killed by the police, and of course the black people that are killed by the police. But most of what we see on the media is the blacks being killed by white officers. We hardly ever hear about black on black or black on white. But I've done my research. I know for a fact it happens. And it happens often enough. But you have, and I say this because I've watched many black people on YouTube that coin Al Sharpton and Louis Farrakhan as race pimps. And even though I haven't listened to Al Sharpton, I've listened to Louis Farrakhan, I like how he presents himself, but I do have to agree that they seem to outline the white on black as if they have a underlying motive to encourage racism, encourage hatred. We have to band together. We have to stay together. That's the only way that we're going to endure the future and hopefully change things, real change for the good. That being said, I am suspicious that the one percenters, who I am suspicious that they are all white, people like the Rothschilds, the ones that call the shots for even our presidents, I am suspicious that they look down on all races, but especially the black race. We all have heard of subliminal messaging in commercials, movies, etc. Well, I've stumbled across something that I'm suspicious that it may have been done on purpose for the sole purpose of subliminal racism. I could be wrong, but please give me your opinion after viewing this entire video. Okay, so here I am at the vet, been there a few times, didn't notice before. Most of these pictures have animals on them, these brochures for heartworms, etc. As you go down a little lower, we're going to see pictures of people, but several people, 2 or 3 on one pamphlet. But then there's just one pamphlet that has just one person on it, which happens to be a young, beautiful black woman, and it's under the heading of external parasites. Now, according to Webster's definition, a couple definitions, an organism living in, with, or on another organism, and something that resembles a biological parasite independent on something else for existence or support without making a useful or adequate return. Could we add to society to that? Is that possible that that's what this whole thing was about, subliminal racism? Please leave your comments. Okay, so again, I believe that we're being played against each other as much as they possibly can. By the way, in case you're wondering, this is the Banfield vet that can probably be found mostly in your PetSmart. This right here is what I believe their end goal would be, possibly in the future. You know, not to say these people have every right to be upset. The police brutality needs to stop. All life matters. But in the end, you know, after this goes down like this, there could be some serious ramifications coming their way. Again, I'm not saying racism does not exist at all. I know there's people that are racist. I know that the blacks go through this pretty often. Okay, that's not the point I'm making. But these people that we're dealing with, the elite, they're masterminds of how to sway public opinion. Trust me on this. They've been doing this for a very, very long time. And people before them that have been in control have been doing this for a very, very long time. Just know that not everyone is racist, and we need to heal the wounds and come together. To give you an example of the elite's mindset, let's look at a short speech.
That for the first time in human history, for the first time in all of human history, almost all of mankind is politically awake. And these new and old major powers face still yet another novel reality, in some respects unprecedented. And it is that while the lethality of their power is greater than ever, their capacity to impose control over the politically awakened masses of the world is at a historical low. I once put it rather pungently, and I was flattered that the British Foreign Secretary repeated this as follows. Namely, in earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people, literally. It was easier to control 1 million people than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people. It is easier to kill than to control, 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 kill than to control.
That profound statement comes from people that pull the strings and control people. This is about control. If they can get us to fight amongst each other and hate each other, they know that we will never come together. Now let's look at further evidence of what the elite want to have done that can be tied to the Bible, called the Georgia
the
Guidestones.
bloodiest in man's history. Some 170 million lives were lost to Nazism, communism, and the various killing fields of the world because of the darkness in the hearts of men. The Bible warns that the heart of man is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, including murder. Next, we turn to the town of Elberton, Georgia, the granite capital of the world. Elberton is famous for its production of tombstones, exporting some 250,000 tombstones every year. Oddly enough, the town that makes a living through death is also the home of what some consider the most threatening monument in America. A monument that some believe is a symbol for the coming Holocaust, promoting a depopulation effort at a massive scale.
It was back in 1979 when a stranger came to Elberton, Georgia. Now, Elberton, Georgia is on the eastern part of Georgia, very close to the South Carolina border. And this stranger said that he was part of a secret group, and they wanted to build a great granite monument.
This was done by a guy who gave a pseudonym, came in, paid cash, had this company set these things up in 1980, called himself R.C. Christian, but that's not his real name. It says it right on the stones, a pseudonym.
Nobody knows his real name because that isn't his real name. Nobody knows who put the money up other than this fictional individual. Nobody knows what secret group he represents. Of course, Elberton mines granite. They make tombstones there. And they had the facilities to mine the granite. But he gave very, very specific directions as to how this was to be built, so that it would always be aligned in certain ways, so you'd always be able to see the North Star, so it would be aligned with the moon and with the various phases of the sun. And very, very similar to the Stonehenge that they have in England. So the Stonehenge was a Druidic monument. This was to be the American Stonehenge, or it's known as the Georgia Guidestones. And on each one of the Guidestones is this message in a different language, actually 8 different languages. Are the 10 commandments that come from the dark side. And the first one is maintain the world population at 500 million in constant balance with nature, which doesn't sound too bad until you realize that we've got over 6 billion people in the world. And if we're going to maintain the world population at 500 million in constant balance with nature, we're going to have to kill off about 90% or more of the world's population.
People, we need to wake up. Turn off the sports, turn off the video games, turn off whatever your addiction is. There are people that can tell you every player, every team there ever was, but they cannot tell you basic information that we've covered in this. They do not study, they do not research. If we're going to have a future, this has to happen. We have to come together. Now I leave you with a short video called The Story of Your Enslavement. May God bless and keep you. Seek truth, seek God, that we may be free. Bad Dog out.
This is the story of your enslavement. How it came to be, and how you can finally be free. Like all animals, human beings want to dominate and exploit the resources around them. At first, we mostly hunted and fished and ate off the land, but then something magical and terrible happened to our minds. We became, alone among the animals, afraid of death and of future loss. And this was the start of a great tragedy and an even greater possibility. You see, when we become afraid of death, of injury and imprisonment, we become controllable and so valuable in a way that no other resource could ever be. The greatest resource for any human being to control is not natural resources or tools or animals or land, but other human beings. You can frighten an animal because animals are afraid of pain in the moment, but you cannot frighten an animal with a loss of liberty, with torture or imprisonment in the future, because animals have very little sense of tomorrow. You cannot threaten a cow with torture or a sheep with death. You cannot swing a sword at a tree and scream at it to produce more fruit, or hold a burning torch to a field and demand more wheat. You cannot get more eggs by threatening a hen, but you can get a man to give you his eggs by threatening him. This human farming has been the most profitable and destructive occupation throughout history, and it is now reaching its destructive climax. Human society cannot be rationally understood until it is seen for what it is: a series of farms where human farmers own human livestock. Some people get confused because governments provide healthcare and water and education and roads, and thus imagine that there is some benevolence at work. Nothing could be further from the reality. Farmers provide healthcare and irrigation and training to their livestock. Some people get confused because we are allowed certain liberties and thus imagine that our governments protect our freedoms. But farmers plant their crops a certain distance apart to increase their yields, and will allow certain animals larger stalls or fields if it means they will produce more meat and milk. In your country, your tax farm, your farmer grants you certain freedoms, not because he cares about your liberties, but because he wants to increase his profits. Are you beginning to see the nature of the cage you were born into? There have been 4 major phases of human farming. The first phase in ancient Egypt was direct and brutal human compulsion. Human bodies were controlled, but the creative productivity of the human mind remained beyond the reach of the whip and the brand and the shackles. Slaves remained woefully underproductive and required enormous resources to control. The second phase was the Roman model, wherein slaves were granted some capacity for freedom, ingenuity, and creativity, which raised their productivity. This increased the wealth of Rome, and thus the tax income of the Roman government, and with this additional wealth, Rome became an empire, destroying the economic freedoms that fed its power, and collapsed. I'm sure that this does not seem entirely unfamiliar. After the collapse of Rome, the feudal model introduced the concept of livestock ownership and taxation. Instead of being directly owned, peasants farmed land that they could retain as long as they paid off the local warlords. This model eventually broke down due to the continual subdivision of productive land and was destroyed during the enclosure movement when land was consolidated and hundreds of thousands of peasants were kicked off their ancestral lands because new farming techniques made larger farms more productive with fewer people. The increased productivity of the later Middle Ages created the excess food required for the expansion of towns and cities, which in turn gave rise to the modern democratic model of human ownership. As displaced peasants flooded into the cities, a huge stock of cheap human capital became available to the rising industrialists. And the ruling class of human farmers quickly realized that they could make more money by letting their livestock choose their own occupations. Under the democratic model, direct slave ownership has been replaced by the mafia model. The mafia rarely owns businesses directly, but rather sends thugs around once a month to steal from the business owners. You are now allowed to choose your own occupation, which raises your productivity, and thus the taxes you can pay to your masters.
Value this time in your life, kids, because this is the time in your life when you still have your choices. And it goes by so fast. When you're a teenager, you think you can do anything, and you do. Your 20s are a blur. 30s, you raise your family, you make a little money, and you think to yourself, what happened to my 20s? 40s, you grow a little pot belly, you grow another chin. The music starts to get too loud. One of your old girlfriends from high school becomes a grandmother. 50s, you have a minor surgery. You'll call it a procedure, but it's a surgery. 60s, you'll have a major surgery. The music is still loud, but it doesn't matter because you can't hear it anyway. 70s, you and the wife retire to Fort Lauderdale. Start eating dinner at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You have lunch around 10, breakfast the night before. Spend most of your time wandering around malls looking for the ultimate soft yogurt and muttering, how come the kids don't call? How come the kids don't call? The 80s, you'll have a major stroke. You end up battling with some Jamaican nurse who your wife can't stand, but who you call mama. Any questions?
Your few freedoms are preserved because they are profitable to your owners. The great challenge of the democratic model is that increases in wealth and freedom threaten the farmers. The ruling classes initially profit from a relatively free market in capital and labor, but as their livestock become more used to their freedoms and growing wealth, they begin to question why they need rulers at all. Well, nobody ever said that human farming was easy. Keeping the taxed livestock securely in the compounds of the ruling classes is a three-phase process. The first is to indoctrinate the young through government, quote, education. As the wealth of democratic countries grew, government schools were universally inflicted in order to control the thoughts and souls of the livestock. The second phase is to turn citizens against each other through the creation of dependent livestock. It is very difficult to rule human beings directly through force, and where it can be achieved, it remains cripplingly underproductive, as can be seen in North Korea. Human beings do not breed well or produce efficiently in direct captivity. But if human beings believe that they are free, then they will produce much more for their farmers. The best way to maintain this illusion of freedom is to put some of the livestock on the payroll of the farmer. Those cows that become dependent on the existing hierarchy will then attack any other cows who point out the violence, hypocrisy, and immorality of human ownership.
Officers positioned Grant face first on the floor with one officer near his head, a second near his back, and a third officer standing nearby. There appeared to be a brief struggle. Then, a 2-year veteran BART officer stands, draws his weapon, and fires.
Freedom is slavery, and slavery is freedom. If you can get the cows to attack each other whenever anybody brings up the reality of their situation, then you don't have to spend nearly as much controlling them directly. Those cows who become dependent upon the stolen largesse of the farmer will violently oppose any questioning of the virtue of human ownership, and the intellectual and artistic classes, always and forever dependent upon the farmers, will say to anyone who demands freedom from ownership, "You will harm your fellow cows." The livestock are thus kept enclosed by shifting the moral responsibility for the destructiveness of the violent system to those who demand real freedom. The third phase is to invent continual external threats so that the frightened livestock cling to the protection of the farmers. This system of human farming is now nearing its end. The terrible tragedies of modern Western economic systems has occurred not in spite of, but because of past economic freedoms. The massive increases in Western wealth throughout the 19th century resulted from economic freedoms. And it was this very increase in wealth that fed the size and power of the state. Whenever the livestock become exponentially more productive, you get a corresponding increase in the number of farmers and their dependents. The growth of the state is always proportional to the preceding economic freedoms. Economic freedoms create wealth, and the wealth attracts more thieves and political parasites, whose greed then destroys the economic freedoms. In other words, freedom metastasizes the cancer of the state. The government that starts off the smallest will always end up the largest. This is why there can be no viable and sustainable alternative to a truly free and peaceful society. A society without political rulers, without human ownership, without the violence of taxation and statism. To be truly free is both very easy and very hard. We avoid the horror of our enslavement because it is so painful to see it directly. We dance around the endless violence of our dying system because we fear the attacks of our fellow livestock. But we can only be kept in the cages we refuse to see. Wake up. To see the farm is to leave it.
Kill me before the war is over, will you? It appears you are not the better man. You're right. My sons were better men.
Sound the retreat. Sound! Retreat.